All right, so tonight we're not just talking about any old monarchs. We're going deep into the genetic shallow end, if you will. We're talking about the Hapsburgs. Yes, those Hapsburgs. The ones who, bless their hearts, really committed to the bit when it came to keeping it all in the family. Because, why expand your gene pool when you have such a perfectly good, albeit increasingly shallow one right there? It's a classic royal strategy, really. Consolidate power, marry your cousins, and hope for the best. Sometimes it worked out. Other times you get what we affectionately call the Hapsburg jaw. Let's float over to a particular branch of this rather intricate family tree, specifically the Spanish Hapsburgs. Now, when we think of powerful, grand European dynasties, the Hapsburgs definitely spring to mind. They ruled vast swaths of Europe for centuries. They had a lot of gold, a lot of land, and, as it turns out, a lot of very similar-looking relatives. And it all kind of culminated, or perhaps degenerated, in the person of Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles II, who was born in 1661, is often remembered, if he's remembered at all, as Charles the Bewitched, which, is not exactly a flattering nickname. It usually means things aren't going great for you. He was the last of the Spanish Hapsburgs, and his life, from pretty much the moment he entered the world, was a testament to what happens when you decide that marrying your relatives is a superior long-term strategy. Spoilers, it's generally not. His parents, for a start, were Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece, because, as we've established, the Habsburgs loved keeping it tight. Philip IV already had a son, Balthazar Charles, who was, by all accounts, a pretty promising kid. But because royal life in the 17th century was a bit of a lottery, Balthazar Charles, unfortunately, died at the tender age of 16. So Philip, needing an heir, decided to marry his niece, because again, options were apparently limited to immediate family members. This particular union resulted in Charles II, and it wasn't exactly a picture of robust health from the get-go. When Charles was born, he was described as being rather frail. He had an enlarged head, a weak body, and a tongue so big it made speaking and eating quite difficult. Imagine being a baby and your own tongue is actively working against you. That's a rough start. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old and didn't speak until he was 4, and even then his speech was apparently pretty garbled. All of this, of course, was attributed to witchcraft by the superstitious court, because why blame decades of enthusiastic inbreeding when you can just blame a disgruntled sorcerer? Makes perfect sense. His childhood was predictably not easy. His mother, Mariana, was very protective, perhaps overly so. She treated him like a perpetual infant, which, given his physical state, probably didn't help his development. He was kept largely isolated from other children, not exactly the ideal recipe for social or intellectual growth. He was apparently quite fond of sweets, which, let's be honest, who isn't? But given his already poor health and dental issues, it probably wasn't doing him any favors. Let's just pause here for a moment and really consider the Hapsburg jaw. This isn't just a bit of an overbite we're talking about. This was a pronounced facial deformity, characterized by a protruding lower jaw and a thick lower lip. It was so common in the Hapsburgs that you can trace it through portraits for generations. It was their unofficial family crest in a way, and Charles II had it in spades. It was so severe that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet, which contributed to his difficulty eating and, let's be frank, probably made him drool quite a bit. Not exactly the image of regal power, is it? His cognitive abilities were also a subject of much debate and concern. Some historians have suggested he had some form of intellectual disability, while others argue that his physical ailments simply made it incredibly difficult for him to function normally. Either way, it meant that ruling a vast empire, which included Spain, parts of Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and a good chunk of the Americas, was a task that he was decidedly ill-equipped for. But, he was born into it, so he was stuck with it. Tough luck, Charles. The court of Spain during Charles II's reign was a bizarre place. It was formal, riddled with rigid etiquette, and suffocated by religious piety. While other courts were embracing the Enlightenment, Spain was still very much stuck in its own anachronistic world. And at the center of it all was this frail, sickly, and largely ineffective king. His counselors and various factions basically ran the country, often in conflicting directions, while Charles mostly shuffled around signing whatever papers were put in front of him. Because really, what else was he going to do? Stage a coup? Unlikely. His mother, Mariana, acted as regent for much of his early reign, and she wasn't exactly a political genius herself. She surrounded herself with favorites and often made decisions that were, shall we say, less than optimal for the stability of the kingdom. It was a real mess. Imagine being a teenager and your mom is still telling you what to do, and she's also trying to run an empire that's slowly collapsing around her. Poor Charles. Now, a king, especially one who is the last of his line, needs to produce an heir. This was a non-negotiable part of the job description. So, despite his physical difficulties, Charles was married off, first in 1679 to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess. She was described as pretty and vivacious, which, when you compare her to her new husband, highlights the extreme contrast. It was, predictably, not a happy marriage. Marie-Louise was apparently shocked by Charles's appearance and his general demeanor, which, fair enough. She was also very stressed by the constant pressure to produce an heir. The Spanish court was obsessed with fertility, as you can imagine. Every ailment, every delay was scrutinized and discussed. Marie-Louise tried to adapt, but she grew increasingly melancholy. The food was apparently not to her liking, the climate was oppressive, and her husband was, well, Charles. She reportedly confided that she would rather be dead than continue her life in Spain. Cheerful stuff, right? After 10 years of marriage, during which she failed to produce any children, Marie-Louise died quite suddenly in 1689. The official cause was appendicitis, but rumors, as always, swirled about poisoning. Because in royal courts, sudden deaths almost always lead to whispers of foul play. So, no heir, and now a dead wife. Time for a new queen. Because why not double down on a strategy that clearly isn't working? Charles's second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She arrived in Spain in 1690, and she was apparently a much more assertive character than Marie-Louise. She was also under immense pressure to produce a child, a son specifically, to secure the Hapsburg line. And again, nothing. No children. This led to even more desperation and, frankly, some bizarre attempts to cure Charles's supposed infertility. Court physicians, in their infinite wisdom, tried all sorts of remedies, from strange herbal concoctions to even stranger rituals. At one point, Charles was apparently made to wear a shirt that had been worn by Saint Diego of Alcala, because, a saint's sweaty shirt is definitely going to fix centuries of genetic mismanagement. It didn't work, of course. The lack of an heir was a huge problem, not just for Charles, but for all of Europe. The Spanish throne was one of the most powerful in the world, and without a direct Hapsburg successor, it meant a power vacuum was looming, and everyone knew what that meant: war. Specifically, the War of Spanish Succession, which, sure enough, broke out shortly after Charles' death. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Charles's final years were truly a spectacle of decline. He suffered from a litany of ailments: convulsions, hallucinations, painful swellings, and severe headaches. He was often unable to perform even the simplest tasks. His health was so poor that he was barely able to attend to any state affairs. The Hapsburg jaw, which had been a family trait for generations, was now, in Charles, almost a caricature. It was a physical manifestation of a dynasty in its death throes. His doctors, again, had no idea what to do. They tried various bleedings and purges, which, as we know, usually did more harm than good. They were essentially just watching him slowly deteriorate, trying whatever medieval remedies they could think of. It was a rather sad and undignified end for a king who, through no fault of his own, was a biological anomaly. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38. His autopsy reportedly was quite revealing, or at least revealing in a morbid kind of way. It apparently showed a heart the size of a peppercorn, intestines that were putrid and gangrenous, and a single testicle black as coal. Not exactly a glowing report. His body, in essence, was a catalog of genetic deformities and illnesses. It was a tragic end, not just for a person, but for an entire dynastic branch. The ground, in this case meaning Charles's very DNA, told a story of a family that had quite literally married itself into a corner. The obsession with pure bloodlines and dynastic continuity had, paradoxically, led to its own undoing, and the consequence, as predicted, was a massive European conflict that reshaped the continent. All because a family just couldn't bring themselves to look beyond their first cousins when it came to finding a spouse. It's a gentle reminder that sometimes mixing things up a little bit is actually a really good idea. Let's just gently move on from Charles and his incredibly unfortunate jaw, shall we?
Tonight, we're going to meander through the lives of some figures who, while legendary in their own right, also had some spectacularly messy personal lives, often thanks to the expectations of their station. We're talking about the Plantagenets, specifically focusing on the rather iconic figure of Richard I, often known as Richard the Lionheart. Now, Lionheart conjures up images of chivalry, bravery, crusades, and all that good stuff. And yes, Richard was a fearsome warrior, and by all accounts a charismatic leader. But when it came to his personal life, it was, shall we say, a bit less lion-hearted and a bit more reluctantly dragged along. Let's begin with his parents, because, as we've established, royal parents are often the root of all subsequent royal weirdness. Richard was the son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and what a pair they were! Henry II was a dynamic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless king who consolidated a vast empire in France and England. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, quite simply, one of the most powerful and influential women of the Middle Ages. She was already Queen of France, divorced her first husband, Louis VII, because he was apparently a bit too pious and boring for her taste, and then married Henry. This was scandalous at the time, of course, but Eleanor rarely let things like scandal get in her way. Their marriage, despite producing 8 children, was a tempestuous one, full of passion, betrayal, and ultimately open warfare. Henry was a notorious philanderer, and Eleanor was not one to sit idly by. She eventually encouraged her sons, including Richard, to rebel against their father, because, family fun. This great revolt of 1173 to 1174 was ultimately suppressed, and Eleanor was imprisoned by Henry for over a decade. Imagine being locked up by your husband for encouraging your kids to stage a coup. It was a truly dysfunctional family dynamic, setting a rather dramatic stage for Richard's own life. Richard himself was born in 1157. He was not the eldest son, but eventually became heir after his older brother, Henry the Young King, died in 1183. Richard was known for his striking looks, his skill as a knight, and his love of poetry and music. Yes, the Lionheart also dabbled in troubadour arts. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of a medieval knight. He was also, by most accounts, not terribly interested in governing England. His heart was truly in his French possessions and, most importantly, in the Crusades. Now, a king, especially one who wants to secure his dynasty, needs a queen and, ideally, an heir. This was just part of the job. For many years, Richard was betrothed to Alice, the daughter of Louis VII of France, Eleanor's first husband, remember. This was a political match designed to secure peace between England and France. However, this betrothal dragged on for years, partly because Henry, Richard's father, was rumored to have had an affair with Alice. Yes, he apparently slept with his son's fiancée, because why not add another layer of weirdness to an already messy family? This made the idea of Richard actually marrying Alice rather awkward, to say the least. So when Richard finally became king in 1189 after his father's death, he immediately set about preparing for the Third Crusade. He wasn't going to let something as trivial as getting married stand in the way of saving the Holy Land. However, his mother, Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, knew he needed a wife. So while Richard was busy gathering armies and funds, Eleanor, at the ripe old age of 67, personally traveled to Navarre to arrange a marriage for her son, because some moms just never stop. Eleanor successfully negotiated a marriage between Richard and Berengaria of Navarre. Berengaria was the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. She was described as beautiful, intelligent, and pious, a suitable match politically and personally, or so everyone hoped. The wedding, however, was a bit of an anticlimax. Richard met Berengaria in Messina, Sicily, in 1191, en route to the Holy Land, and he apparently decided he didn't want to marry her just yet, because, crusades first, then wives. He then sailed off to Cyprus, where he promptly conquered the island, because why not add an island to your empire while you're on a holy war vacation? Berengaria and Eleanor eventually caught up with Richard in Cyprus, and it was there, in Limassol, that Richard finally married Berengaria, on May 12, 1191. It's said he married her because Easter was approaching, and canon law prohibited unchaperoned women from traveling on the same ship as a king during Holy Week. So basically, he married her because it was logistically convenient for sailing. Not exactly the stuff of romantic legends, is it? Their marriage, by all accounts, was pretty much a formality. Richard immediately left for the Holy Land, continuing his crusade. Berengaria accompanied him for a bit, but mostly stayed in Acre, a coastal city, while Richard was off fighting. He spent most of his time with Joanna, Richard's sister, who was the former queen of Sicily. It sounds like they had a perfectly nice time, away from the actual fighting. Richard spent most of his reign, which lasted 10 years, either fighting in the Crusades or defending his French territories. He spent less than 6 months of his entire reign in England, so his wife wasn't seeing him, nor was his kingdom, frankly. Richard and Berengaria never had any children. This was, of course, a significant issue. A king needs an heir. The lack of children is often attributed to Richard's prolonged absences, but there have also been historical suggestions that Richard might have been homosexual. This is, of course, difficult to prove definitively from medieval records, but his strong preference for male company and his apparent indifference to his wife have led some historians to this conclusion. Either way, Berengaria was effectively queen in name only, spending most of her married life apart from her husband. She apparently loved him, though, and outlived him by many years, eventually retiring to a monastery. A rather quiet end for the queen of a lion-hearted king. Richard himself died in 99, not in some grand battle in the Holy Land, but from a crossbow bolt wound while besieging a minor castle in France, because, anticlimactic. He was hunting down some treasure that a local lord was supposedly holding. It was a rather ignominious end for such a legendary figure, and his death, of course, meant that his younger brother John inherited the throne. And King John, as we shall see, was a whole other kettle of fish, mostly a rather unpleasant and slimy kettle of fish. Let's gently transition from the crusading, absent Richard and his lonely queen to his younger brother, King John. Now, if Richard was the dashing, if somewhat aloof hero, John was the opposite of that. He's pretty much universally considered one of England's worst kings. He earned the nickname Lackland because he inherited almost no land from his father, which was an early indicator that things weren't going to go great for him. And then he lost most of what he did get, so maybe John the Land Loser would have been more accurate.
All right, let's drift now from the romanticized yet personally distant figure of Richard the Lionheart and gently float over to his younger brother, King John. Now, if Richard was the kind of guy who would write a heroic ballad about himself, John was the guy they wrote very unheroic ballads about. He's often seen as the villain in the Robin Hood stories, and for good reason. He was, to put it mildly, not a popular guy. His reign was a masterclass in how not to be a good king, or frankly, a good person. John was born in 1166, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Being the youngest, he wasn't really expected to inherit much, hence the Lackland moniker. He was apparently his father's favorite, at least for a while, which probably didn't endear him to his older brothers. And given that his older brothers spent a lot of time rebelling against their father, Being the favorite of the king was probably a pretty lonely position. His relationship with his family was predictably awful. He betrayed his father, Henry II, at the very end of Henry's life, aligning himself with Richard, because why not kick your dad when he's down? Then, when Richard was off crusading and later imprisoned in Germany, John tried to seize the throne from him. This was famously depicted in the Robin Hood legends, where John is trying to usurp the absent Richard, and it's pretty accurate. Richard, when he eventually returned, forgave John, because, brotherly love, or perhaps just pragmatism. But it set the tone for John's character, opportunistic, untrustworthy, and generally unpleasant. When Richard died in 1199, John finally got his wish and became king, and that's when things really started to go downhill for everyone involved. John was intellectually capable, sometimes even charming, but he was also deeply insecure, petty, cruel, and incredibly suspicious. He had a nasty temper and was known for his fits of rage. He was also, by many accounts, rather lecherous, so not exactly the ideal package for a monarch. Let's talk about his wives, because as with all good royal stories, marital drama is never far away. John's first marriage was in 1189 to Isabella of Gloucester. This was a purely political marriage, arranged by his father, Henry II, even before John became king. Isabella was the heiress to a significant earldom, so it was a good financial match. However, when John became king, he almost immediately had their marriage annulled, because apparently they were too closely related, which in medieval Europe was a pretty flexible rule, generally invoked when it was politically convenient. In John's case, it meant he could marry someone else. His second marriage, and the one that caused a significant international incident, was to Isabella of Angoulême. This happened in 1200, when John was already 33, and Isabella was, she was about 12 years old. Yes, you heard that right, 12. Because, why marry someone your own age when you can marry a child? This was, unfortunately, not uncommon in medieval royal circles, but it was still a bit eyebrow-raising. The problem wasn't just her age, it was that Isabella was already betrothed to Hugh X of Lusignan, a powerful French nobleman. John, being John, decided he liked Isabella, and, being king, just took her. He basically abducted her and married her. This was, as you can imagine, a massive insult to Hugh X and his family, and it gave King Philip II of France, John's arch-rival, the perfect excuse to launch a war against him, because, really, John made it so easy for his enemies. This act of pure hubris led directly to John losing almost all of England's vast possessions in France, including Normandy, the ancestral home of the English monarchy. This was a huge blow to his prestige and a massive loss of revenue and land, all because he decided to steal a child bride from a French nobleman. It's a classic example of royal "I want it, so I'll take it" backfiring spectacularly. His marriage to Isabella of Angoulême produced 5 children, including his heir, the future Henry III. So, in that sense, it was successful. But their personal relationship was, predictably, not exactly a love match. Isabella was described as beautiful and fiery, and she apparently had quite a temper, much like John. They reportedly had numerous quarrels, and Isabella was often kept under strict supervision. She was, after all, a queen who had been effectively kidnapped and married. It's hard to imagine a stable, loving relationship forming under those circumstances. John's reputation for cruelty extended beyond his political enemies into his personal life. He was rumored to have starved his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, to death in Rouen Castle, who had a competing claim to the throne. This was, again, something out of a villain's playbook. He also reportedly had a number of illegitimate children and mistresses. One famous story tells of him having one of his former mistresses, Matilda de Braus, and her son starved to death in prison, because why be subtle when you can be overtly horrifying? These stories, whether entirely true or embellished, certainly cemented his reputation as bad King John. His reign was a constant struggle. He was constantly at odds with the French. He lost his continental possessions, and he taxed his English barons mercilessly to fund his wars. This, as you can imagine, made him incredibly unpopular. His heavy-handed rule and disregard for traditional rights eventually led to the biggest crisis of his reign, the Rebellion of the Barons. In 1215, the exasperated English barons finally had enough. They marched on London and forced John to sign a document that limited the power of the king. This document, of course, was Magna Carta. Now, John signed it, but he had absolutely no intention of upholding it. As soon as the barons dispersed, he appealed to the Pope to have it annulled, which the Pope, being a good ally, promptly did. This, predictably, led to a civil war, known as the First Barons' War, because John just couldn't seem to catch a break, or more accurately, he couldn't stop making terrible decisions. The last year of John's life was spent fighting this civil war. He wandered around England trying to put down the rebellion, alienating more and more people as he went. He was, by all accounts, exhausted, ill, and increasingly paranoid. He reportedly lost his baggage, including the crown jewels, in a tidal estuary known as the Wash, while trying to cross it. Just another unfortunate incident in a long string of unfortunate incidents for John. He died on October 19, 1216, at the age of 49, probably from dysentery, though some sources suggest he was poisoned, because, again, rumors love to swirl around unpopular monarchs. His death was greeted with a sigh of relief by almost everyone in England. He left behind a kingdom in chaos, a civil war still raging, and a reputation as arguably the worst king England ever had. It's a testament to his sheer unpopularity that the name John has rarely been used for English monarchs since. So, from the charismatic but absent Richard, we descend to the petty, cruel, and very present John. Two brothers, both kings, both with complicated personal lives that shaped the course of history, albeit in very different ways. Richard dying heroically in a minor French skirmish, and John dying ignominiously of dysentery while fleeing rebellious barons. It just goes to show you that a crown doesn't necessarily make you a good person, or even a particularly lucky one. Let's gently drift away from the troubled reign of King John and explore another set of royals who also had their fair share of difficulties. Let's now ease our way into a completely different era, one where grand titles often masked some truly precarious existences. We're going to glide over to the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, complex, and often rather confused entity that existed in Central Europe for over 1,000 years. It wasn't really holy, not really Roman, and arguably not much of an empire by its later stages. But it certainly produced some interesting characters, often burdened with immense expectations, and some rather unique personal traits.
Tonight, we're going to focus on a particular branch of the Hapsburg family again, because, as we've established, they really did have a knack for combining immense power with some spectacularly awkward personal lives. Specifically, we're going to look at the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. He was one of those figures who, on paper, sounds like a grand, powerful ruler, but in reality was a rather reclusive, eccentric, and perpetually melancholic individual who preferred alchemy and art to actually, ruling. Rudolph II was born in 1552, the son of Emperor Maximilian II and Maria of Spain. So another Hapsburg, naturally, marrying another Hapsburg. You can already hear the distant faint sounds of that Hapsburg jaw clicking away in the background. Rudolph's early life was spent in Spain at the court of his maternal uncle, Philip II. This Spanish influence was profound, shaping his personality with its rigid Catholic piety and an emphasis on introspection and melancholia. He returned to Vienna in 1571, a rather shy and withdrawn young man, especially compared to his more outgoing brothers. When he became Holy Roman Emperor in 1576, at the age of 24, it was clear he wasn't exactly thrilled with the job. He moved his court to Prague, which was perhaps the first sign that he wanted to be away from the traditional Hapsburg centers of power. And once in Prague, he really doubled down on the whole reclusive, eccentric monarch vibe. He rarely left the Prague castle, preferring to immerse himself in his various passions. And what were those passions, you ask? Well, Rudolf was absolutely fascinated by the occult and the natural sciences, or what passed for natural sciences in the late 16th century. He was obsessed with alchemy, the search for the philosopher's stone, and the creation of artificial life. He employed numerous alchemists and mystics at his court, including figures like John Dee, the famous English astrologer and alchemist. Imagine being a powerful emperor and your main hobby is trying to turn lead into gold, or perhaps trying to summon spirits in your castle laboratory. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but for Rudolf, it was very much real. He also had a deep love for art and collected an astonishing array of artworks, scientific instruments, and curiosities. His Kunstkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, was legendary, filled with everything from ancient coins to exotic animal specimens, intricate automatons, and rare books. He patronized artists like Giuseppe Arcimboldo, famous for his surreal portraits made of fruits and vegetables. So he had great taste in art, but perhaps less interest in, say, governing his vast and increasingly fractious empire. His personality was marked by severe mood swings, periods of deep depression, and extreme reclusiveness. He avoided public appearances and often refused to meet with diplomats or even his own family members. He was perpetually unmarried, which for a Holy Roman Emperor was a significant problem. His family, of course, pressured him endlessly to marry and produce an heir, because, the whole point of a dynasty is to have a dynasty, but Rudolf simply wouldn't do it. He had a strong aversion to women and marriage, preferring the company of his male servants and, allegedly, his horses. He did have a long-term mistress, Catherine Strada, the daughter of his art dealer, with whom he had several illegitimate children. These children, however, could not inherit the imperial throne, so the pressure for a legitimate heir remained constant. His inability or unwillingness to marry was a source of immense frustration for his family and a constant worry for the future of the Hapsburg dynasty. It was a classic royal dilemma, duty versus personal inclination, with personal inclination winning out, much to the chagrin of everyone else. His reign coincided with a period of intense religious and political tension in Europe. The Protestant Reformation was still causing ripples, and the seeds of the 30 Years' War were being sown. Rudolf, in his reclusive state, often struggled to make decisive decisions or respond effectively to these challenges. He was at times paralyzed by indecision and prone to bouts of paranoia. He suspected plots everywhere, which, to be fair, was not entirely unfounded in that era, but Rudolf took it to an extreme. His increasingly erratic behavior and his failure to address the pressing political and religious issues of the day led to growing discontent among his family members and the imperial estates. They saw him as a weak and ineffectual ruler, more interested in his esoteric hobbies than in the stability of the empire. This eventually led to a rather humiliating situation, even for a Hapsburg. His younger brother, Matthias, who was far more ambitious and politically astute, decided to take matters into his own hands. In 1606, the Hapsburg family declared Rudolf mentally unfit to rule and appointed Matthias as head of the family. This was, of course, a massive blow to Rudolf's pride, such as it was. Matthias then systematically stripped Rudolf of his various titles and lands. By 1608, Matthias had forced Rudolf to cede Hungary, Austria, and Moravia to him. And by 1611, Rudolf was forced to abdicate the Bohemian throne to Matthias as well. So Rudolf ended his days as a king without a kingdom, or at least without most of his kingdoms. He was effectively confined to Prague Castle, still surrounded by his art and alchemical equipment, but stripped of all real power. It was a rather ignominious end for a Holy Roman Emperor. He died in 1612, a year after his effective deposition, probably from melancholia compounded by other ailments. He was succeeded by Matthias, who then inherited the full mess of the Holy Roman Empire, and as we know, the 30 Years' War wasn't far behind. Rudolf II is a fascinating example of a ruler who simply wasn't cut out for the job. He was a patron of the arts, a curious mind, and a deeply introverted individual who was thrust into one of the most demanding political roles in Europe. His personal struggles, his reclusiveness, and his inability to connect with the realities of his time had profound consequences for his dynasty and for Europe. He was perhaps the ultimate demonstration that sometimes even the most powerful titles come with responsibilities that some people are simply not built for, no matter how many philosopher's stones they try to conjure. And his story certainly reminds us that while history books tell us of grand emperors, the ground, or rather the castle walls of Prague, whisper stories of deeply private, often troubled, and very human figures. Let's gently drift to another corner of the European continent, but this time a bit further north, to Scotland. The Scottish monarchy, while often overshadowed by its larger English neighbor, had its own unique brand of drama, intrigue, and a healthy dose of tragic personal lives. And few figures encapsulate this quite as vividly as Mary, Queen of Scots.
All right, so tonight we're going to settle in with a figure who, if we're being honest, probably had one of the most consistently disastrous personal lives of any monarch in history. We're talking about Mary, Queen of Scots. Her story is a whirlwind of passion, betrayal, political blunders, and ultimately a rather sad end. She was queen from infancy, a beautiful and intelligent woman, but seemingly cursed with an inability to make good decisions when it came to men, or for that matter, when it came to managing her extremely dangerous political situation. Mary was born in 1542, just 6 days before her father, King James V of Scotland, died. He reportedly muttered, upon hearing of her birth, "It came with a lass, and it will go with a lass," referring to the Stuart dynasty's acquisition of the throne through a female ancestor. It was a rather prophetic and deeply melancholic sentiment. So Mary became Queen of Scots literally as a baby, which, makes governing a little tricky. Her childhood was spent largely in France. She was sent there at the age of 5 to be educated and to be betrothed to the French Dauphin, Francis. This was a hugely important political alliance for Scotland, aimed at securing French support against their old enemy, England. Mary grew up in the sophisticated French court, where she was educated as a princess, learning languages, music, and poetry. She was tall, beautiful, and charismatic, quickly becoming a favorite at court. In 1558, at the age of 16, she married Francis. He became King Francis II of France in 1559, making Mary Queen of France as well. For a brief, glorious period, Mary was queen of 2 countries. One of the most powerful women in Europe, and seemingly on top of the world. But as we've come to expect in these stories, that didn't last long. Francis, who was reportedly a rather frail and sickly teenager, died in 1560, after only 17 months on the throne. Suddenly, at the age of 18, Mary was a widow and no longer the Queen of France. Her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, wasn't exactly her biggest fan, so Mary decided it was time to head back to Scotland. Now, Scotland in 1561 was a very different world from the refined court of France. It was a country torn apart by religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation had taken a firm hold, and Mary, a devout Catholic, was returning to a kingdom where her religion was increasingly viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility. She was also a woman,
trying to rule in a world dominated by powerful, often unruly male nobles. Her return was met with a mix of curiosity and tension. She tried to navigate the complex political landscape, showing some initial skill. But then, she started making choices in her personal life that would prove to be her undoing. Let's talk about her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was Mary's first cousin, because why not? He was handsome, tall, and appeared to be a suitable match. Mary was reportedly smitten with him, describing him as the lustiest and best-proportioned long man she had ever seen. However, once they were married in 1565, the reality set in. Darnley was, to put it gently, a complete disaster. He was arrogant, vain, prone to heavy drinking, and utterly demanding. He wanted the crown matrimonial, which would have given him equal power to Mary, something she wisely refused. Their relationship soured almost immediately. Darnley became increasingly resentful and jealous. His jealousy focused on Mary's private secretary, David Rizzio, an Italian musician who had become a close confidant. In a truly horrific scene, Darnley and a group of Protestant nobles burst into Mary's private chambers while she was having dinner, dragged Rizzio out, and stabbed him to death right in front of her. At the time, she was 6 months pregnant with the future James VI of Scotland and James I of England. Imagine the trauma. It's a miracle she didn't lose the baby. Unsurprisingly, this didn't improve their marriage. Mary managed to escape and regain control, but her relationship with Darnley was effectively over. Then, in 1567, things took an even darker turn. Darnley was recuperating from an illness in a house called Kirk of Field. One night, the house was blown up by a massive gunpowder explosion. Darnley's body was found in the garden. He hadn't been killed by the blast, but appeared to have been strangled. The prime suspect was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful and ambitious nobleman who had become Mary's chief advisor. And here is where Mary made her most catastrophic mistake. Only a few months after her husband's suspicious murder, she married Bothwell. Whether she was coerced, kidnapped, or went willingly is still a subject of historical debate, but the optics were terrible. To the Scottish public and the rest of Europe, it looked like she had colluded with her husband's killer. This was the final straw for the Scottish nobles. They rose in rebellion, Mary's army deserted her, and she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI of Scotland and James I of England. She was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, but, ever the romantic heroine, she managed to escape. She fled to England, hoping for protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth was in a bind. Mary was a Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne. To many English Catholics, she was the rightful queen. Elizabeth couldn't let her go free, as she would be a focal point for rebellion, but she also couldn't just execute a fellow monarch. So she did what any pragmatic ruler would do. She kept Mary under house arrest for the next 19 years. Mary spent nearly 2 decades being moved from one cold, damp English castle to another. She spent her time embroidering, writing letters, and plotting, often quite clumsily, to regain her throne or even take Elizabeth's. Eventually, she was caught up in the Babington plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth. This gave Elizabeth the legal excuse she needed. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1787. Her death was as dramatic as her life. She dressed in red, the color of Catholic martyrdom, and maintained her dignity to the end. It reportedly took 3 strikes of the axe to finish the job, and when the executioner lifted her head by the hair, her wig fell off, revealing that her once beautiful hair had turned gray and thin. A final tragic irony for a woman whose life had been defined by her beauty and her station. Mary's story is a haunting reminder of how personal desires and political realities can collide with devastating results. She was a queen who wanted to love and be loved, but in the cutthroat world of 16th century politics, her heart was her greatest liability. Let's drift away from the tragic fate of Mary and float toward another royal family that struggled with the heavy burden of inheritance.
Tonight, we're going to meander through the life of a man who was literally a giant among men, but who struggled with the very human problem of a son who just didn't want to follow in his footsteps. We're talking about Peter the Great. Now, Peter was a force of nature. He was nearly 7 feet tall, which in the late 17th century made him look like a visitor from another planet. He was loud, energetic, and obsessed with dragging Russia, kicking and screaming into the modern age. He built ships with his own hands. He traveled through Europe in disguise to learn how to make clocks and pull teeth. And he even famously taxed beards because he thought they looked too old-fashioned. But while Peter was busy building a new capital city in a swamp, the beautiful, if slightly soggy, St. Petersburg, his personal life was a bit of a train wreck. He had a son, Alexei Petrovich, born from his first marriage to Eudoxia Lapukina. Now, Peter eventually tired of Eudoxia because she was too traditional and sent her to a convent, which was the 17th century Russian version of a quick divorce. This left young Alexei in a bit of an awkward spot. Alexei was the opposite of his father in every way. Where Peter was boisterous and obsessed with war and technology, Alexei was quiet, scholarly, and deeply religious. He preferred reading icons to building frigates. As Alexei grew up, the tension between father and son became a slow-motion disaster. Peter saw his son's lack of interest in the military as a personal insult and a threat to the future of the Russian Empire. He wrote Alexei letters that were less parental advice and more veiled death threats, essentially telling him to change his personality or face the consequences. Eventually, Alexei had enough. In 1716, he fled Russia and sought asylum in the Holy Roman Empire, hiding out in castles across Europe. Imagine the scandal, the heir to the Russian throne running away because he's scared of his dad. Peter was furious. He eventually tricked Alexei into coming back to Russia, promising him a quiet life in the country. Of course, because this is a story about absolute monarchs, a quiet life in the country actually meant a trial for treason. Peter had his own son tortured to uncover a supposed conspiracy. The Ground in Russia tells a very grim story here. Alexei died in a dungeon in 1718 from the injuries he sustained during his interrogation. Peter didn't even stop his work on the fleet to attend the funeral. He was a man who sacrificed his own flesh and blood for the greatness of Russia. It's a chilling reminder that in the world of emperors, being a great ruler often meant being a pretty terrible human being. Let's float over to another royal disaster, this time in the 19th century, where the tragedy was less about violence and more about a profound, drifting sadness. We're going back to the Hapsburgs. Yes, they're back, but this time in Austria during the reign of Emperor Franz Joseph and his legendary wife, Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. Sisi was by all accounts the most beautiful woman in the world at the time. She had hair that reached her ankles and a waist that she famously kept at a staggering 16 inches. But behind the beautiful portraits was a woman who was deeply, profoundly unhappy with the rigid life of the Viennese court. She hated the etiquette, she hated the Spanish rules of the palace, and most of all, she seemed to hate herself. Sisi became obsessed with her appearance in a way that we would today recognize as a severe eating disorder. She lived on a diet of thin broth and orange juice, and she spent hours every day exercising and having her hair brushed. She was a royal wanderer, spending most of her life traveling across Europe on her private yacht or staying in secluded villas, trying to escape the husband who adored her but didn't understand her. Her husband, Franz Joseph, was the ultimate bureaucrat. He woke up at 4 a.m. every morning to work on papers. He was a man of habit and duty, while Sisi was a woman of poetry and restless energy. They were like two planets orbiting different suns. The tragedy of their lives culminated in 1889 at a hunting lodge called Mayerling. Their only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolph, named after our eccentric friend from Part 4, was just as sensitive and troubled as his mother. He felt trapped by his father's conservatism and his own failing marriage.
One morning, Rudolf and his teenage mistress, Mary Vetsera, were found dead in an apparent murder-suicide. The Hapsburg line was broken, and Sisi never wore anything but black for the rest of her life. She drifted across Europe like a ghost until she was eventually assassinated by an anarchist in 1898. Her death was almost an afterthought to her. She had checked out of royal life decades before. Now, let's drift a little farther west to Bavaria, where we find perhaps the most sleepless historian figure of them all, Ludwig II, the fairy tale king. If Peter the Great was obsessed with ships and Rudolf II was obsessed with alchemy, Ludwig was obsessed with, well, set design. Ludwig became king at 18. He was tall, handsome, and deeply romantic. He didn't want to lead armies or balance budgets. He wanted to live in the operas of Richard Wagner. He spent the entire Bavarian treasury building incredible, over-the-top castles that looked like they belonged on the back of a cereal box. Neuschwanstein is the most famous one, the inspiration for the Disney castle, but he also built Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee, which was basically a giant, lonely tribute to Versailles. Ludwig was a nocturnal king. He would sleep all day and wander his castles at night, sometimes riding through the snowy Bavarian woods in an elaborate 18th century slade dressed in furs. He hated being a king in the real world. He once wrote that he wanted to remain an eternal enigma to himself and others. But as we know, governments don't like enigmas, especially ones that spend all the money on grottos made of fake gold. In 1886, his ministers decided they had enough. They declared him insane without actually examining him and deposed him. A few days later, Ludwig was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg, along with the doctor who had declared him mad. Was it suicide? Was it an escape attempt gone wrong? Was it murder? The ground at the bottom of the lake isn't talking. But Ludwig's legacy isn't of war or policy, it's a collection of beautiful, empty palaces that stand as monuments to a man who simply found reality too boring to live in.
Finally, for this part of our journey, let's float back to Russia to witness the final, slow collapse of the Romanovs. We've seen Peter the Great sacrifice his son for the empire, but the last Tsar, Nicholas II, did the opposite. He sacrificed the empire for his son. Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra, were a rare thing in royal history, a couple who were genuinely, deeply in love. But their personal happiness was shadowed by a terrifying secret. Their only son, Alexei, had hemophilia, the royal disease passed down from Queen Victoria. In an era before modern medicine, a simple bruise could mean a slow, agonizing death for the boy. This secret drove Alexandra into the arms of the infamous Grigory Rasputin, a holy man who seemed to be the only one able to stop the boy's bleeding. The presence of this dirty, eccentric Siberian peasant in the palace gardens caused a national scandal. The people didn't know about the boy's illness, so they assumed Rasputin was running the country through some dark influence over the Empress. While Nicholas was a kind father and a devoted husband, he was an utterly disastrous Tsar. He was indecisive, stubborn, and completely out of touch with the changing world. He preferred playing with his children in the palace gardens to dealing with the growing revolution outside the gates. By the time 1917 rolled around, the ground was shifting beneath his feet, and there was no way to stop the slide. The end for the Romanovs wasn't a slow fading away. It was a sudden, dark basement in Siberia in 1918.
The entire family, the Tsar, the Empress, the 4 beautiful daughters, and the sickly little boy, were executed in the middle of the night. It was a tragic, messy end to a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries, a final chapter written in the blood of a family that perhaps was never meant to hold the weight of a crown in the first place. Would you like me to continue with part 11, perhaps drifting into the strange world of the Sun King, Louis XIV, or the tragic, isolated lives of the last emperors of China? We started tonight with a thought. History books tell us one thing, but the ground tells us something completely different. Today, we look at the gilded lives of these monarchs as if they were legends, but in reality, their lives were often golden cages. Peter the Great sacrificed his own flesh and blood to build a modern empire, yet that empire eventually crumbled into dust. The Hapsburgs obsessed over keeping their bloodline pure, only for nature to rebel, twisting their bodies and ending their line in a genetic tragedy. But here is the most startling realization of all. All the palaces, the diamonds, and the absolute power never actually bought them peace. Empress Sisi spent her life trying to outrun time and herself, only to die at the hands of a stranger, clutching a secret grief she could never escape. King Ludwig hid in his fairy tale castles to avoid a reality he hated. Yet today, those very castles are filled with thousands of tourists, the very thing he dreaded most. But the real twist in the story isn't about their deaths, it's about their humanity. When we examine the remains of these god kings today, when we trace their DNA and study their journals, we find people who were far more fragile than the peasants they ruled. Many died of simple illnesses we cure today with a single pill. Many lived in a state of constant, quiet terror, surrounded by luxury, but starved for a single moment of genuine, unscripted love. History, in the end, teaches us that power is a ghost. We remember the names, but we forget the people. You might be sitting right now where a palace once stood, or walking over the forgotten ruins of a dynasty that thought it would last forever. They believed they were immortal, yet the ground doesn't care about titles. Under the soil, the emperor and the beggar are written in the same language of dust. So the next time you see a crown behind a glass case or a portrait of a stern-faced king, remember the sighs they breathed in the dark. Remember the heavy weight of the crown that eventually crushed them. History isn't just a record of winners. It's a collection of human stories, often tragic, always messy, and deeply, quietly vulnerable.
Let's meander back to England, but a few decades before Mary's execution, to a time of massive religious shifts and a very young, very sickly boy who held the fate of a kingdom in his small, pale hands. We're talking about Edward VI, the son of the infamous Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. Now, Henry VIII spent much of his life obsessed with having a male heir. He broke with the Catholic Church, married 6 different women, and executed 2 of them, all in the pursuit of a son. So when Edward was born in 1537, he was the precious jewel of the Tudor dynasty. His mother, Jane, died just days after his birth, which added a layer of tragedy to his arrival. Henry, for all his faults, seems to have genuinely cared for Edward, treating him with a level of protection that bordered on suffocating. Edward was a brilliant child. By the age of 7, he was learning Latin, Greek, and French. He was deeply serious, intensely religious, and, unfortunately, physically quite weak. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward became king at the age of 9. Now, a 9-year-old cannot rule a country, especially a country as volatile as Tudor England. So his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, stepped in as Lord Protector. Somerset was an ambitious man, and he essentially ruled in Edward's name,
pushing forward the Protestant Reformation with a speed that made many people very uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Edward was growing up in a world of rigid schedules and intense study. He was a cradle Protestant, far more radical in his beliefs than his father had ever been. He kept a detailed journal, which gives us a rare glimpse into the mind of a child king. It's oddly detached, recording the execution of his own uncles with a chilling, clinical calmness. As Edward entered his teenage years, his health began to fail. In early 1553, he caught a cold that turned into a serious chest infection, likely tuberculosis. As he grew weaker, a frantic political game began. If Edward died, the throne would pass to his half-sister Mary, a staunch Catholic who would undo everything the Protestant reformers had worked for. To prevent this, Edward's new lead advisor, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, persuaded the dying 15-year-old king to change the line of succession. They bypassed Mary and her sister Elizabeth and named Edward's cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as her heir. It was a desperate, probably illegal move. Edward died in July 1553 after a long and agonizing illness. He was only 15. His death triggered a brief 9-day reign for Lady Jane Grey before Mary swept into London with popular support and took the throne. Edward's life was short. His reign was largely controlled by others, and his legacy was nearly erased by the sister he tried to disinherit. He was a boy who never got to be a man, a king who was more of a symbol than a ruler, and another example of how the lottery of royal birth can be a very heavy prize to win. Would you like me to continue with Part 7? Perhaps moving into the strange and tragic lives of the Russian czars or the mad kings of Bavaria?